the Welsh Revenue Authority to come into formal being. Our original report, we made some recommendations that further details needed around action plans. And pleased to see the Welsh Government have acted very fully, I think, in response to our recommendation, which they accepted at the time. My work as an observer on the programme board, I've seen those plans come through, and I think the fact that our latest report, we've made actually no recommendations, I think probably itself speaks volumes and is something of a statement of confidence that the programme is in a pretty good place at the moment. We see no merit in making recommendations to simply say you should continue to do things. And so our report sets out where they've got to. It's fair to say a lot of work has been achieved. There is much for them still to do before go live on the 1st of April. And our work, I think, provides a snapshot as at the end of November. And clearly things will have moved on even in the last few weeks since then. But it's fair to say in sort of opening summary that the programme, I think, is in a good place. And our report really sets out how they are getting on a number of fronts around the various work streams.
And although, as you do say, the process does have to speed up now in order for things to be in place for the start of the financial year in 2018, there's nothing that you've noticed in terms of the efficiency of the government that causes you concern that there has been no progress since you took the snapshot at the end of November, or that that process is not continuing to go ahead as you would have expected?
Thank you, Chair. No, there's not really. I'd echo Mike's comments. This report was done, or the work was done in November, and the report was cleared through December. So December has come and gone, and we're into January now. I suppose it's a question you'll pose to the Minister and the officials after this session. But no, I think the plans we saw in place to take the necessary action on the items we identified, things they were still working on, were all in place. We did raise some issues in terms of some of the digital work, which I dare say we'll touch on later. But again, it was pleasing to see that plans are now there to get to the 1st of April and before. We haven't gone back in since the report was done. There's a programme board next week I'm aware of. And what we have done in this report is put a sort of marker down that if things don't progress as they need to, there's an opportunity to come back in February to go in there and report back to yourself as a committee to see whether things are not working. But as it stands at the moment, I think things are going to plan and looking fairly good for the 1st of April go live.
When are you next likely to have a sense of things are going to plan? Is it you mentioned a programme meeting or whatever, that would be the next opportunity?
There's another meeting of the Implementation Programme Board next week, which I'll be attending as an observer. And I think we will get a sense from the papers and the discussion at that meeting as to where things currently are. There is certainly a lot of work that's going on this month around the final beta testing of systems, developing guidance, but I'm not expecting any nasty surprises next week, but obviously I'll wait and see. But as Richard says, we've put a marker down that if we do feel that there are concerns, the Auditor-General is prepared to issue a further report before the 1st of April, but only if we feel it's necessary. But we have also put a marker of our intention to produce a further preparedness review autumn next year, which in part will look back over what hopefully will be a successful launch of 1st of April, but also then we'll look at the preparedness for building up for April 19 with Welsh income tax coming through. Obviously the sums there are much bigger, but that's really around HMRC rather than Revenue Authority.
Indeed. Okay, thank you. Jane Hunt.
Yes, that leads me nicely on to questions about preparing for the Welsh rate of income tax in terms of tax forecasting particularly, because you have acknowledged in your report that Welsh Government's prepared timely forecasts of revenue for the newly devolved taxes and it's developing its approach for the Welsh rates of income tax. Obviously there is an issue about data. How suitable do you feel HMRC data is for modelling the Welsh rates of income tax forecasts?
That's actually a very good question indeed, because it's fair to say that obviously this has not had to been done before for Wales, but HMRC have had to grapple with those issues for Scotland. And again, Wales is in the helpful position of being able to build on the experience from both HMRC and the Scottish Government around developing the Scottish rates of income tax. With that process, it's well documented that there were some issues initially around the identification of Scottish taxpayers. around postcode completeness and accuracy, and further work was needed in quite short order to address that. HMRC clearly have reflected on that as they've gone along. In terms of forecasting quantum of revenue, whilst the tax rates remain the same between the nations, that is rather more straightforward. As soon as you move to any divergence of rate, that starts to raise complications around predictions, around forecasts of revenue, and indeed starts to influence then behaviours, evasion risks, etc., etc. So it is problematic, but I think the fact that they can learn from the experience over the last 2 or 3 years with HMRC in Scotland, I think is certainly putting them in a better place as a starting point.
Yes, I mean, obviously...
Can I just, so Mike, specifically on this, I think, if that's okay.
Scotland is different to Wales in many respects, one of which is there's very little daily travel, work travel across the border in Scotland, where there's substantial daily work travel in both directions, especially in North East Wales. It went substantially wrong in Scotland with some very high-profile cases of people who were not identified easily in the right place. That I can understand. I can also understand the problems of people who are sort of working in England or working in Scotland and whose main home is in one or the other. These are problems which Wales will have as well. But it's huge amount of cross-border movement. I mean, you just take 2 of the big employers. I mean, Ellesmere Port Car Factory, got people going from Wales, and the Airbus factory, people coming from England. I mean, you've got lots of major employers. Now, I don't see any problem with the major employers. They'll know where people live. But you've got little garage in Wrexham, little garage in Chester, who may not really have much interest in where their staff live, but although they collect pay as you earn. I mean, what work is being done to try and ensure that we get down to those much smaller employers, employing 3 or 4, perhaps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, that they actually know where their staff live and where they live at any one time? Because there's a lot of movement. A lot of people move across from Wrexham to Chester and back again. Anybody who's driven up to North Wales knows you travel in and out of Wales and Scotland several times along the border journey.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a deal of work here to be done primarily by HMRC. But there are things here around engagement with the large employers, but also, as you say, Mike, with smaller employers. You're right, it is more of a problem in terms of the volume of cross-border travel along the England-Wales border than the England-Scotland border. But the definition of Welsh taxpayer is defined in terms of residence rather than where people are working. And so it's getting that accuracy around home addresses will be absolutely key.
Yeah. So I was just saying that some of the smaller employers don't necessarily, they might have the address, but they might not know whether it's in, might not actually have it with postcode. Because they may not need it for any general reasons.
But HMRC will need it now.
Yeah,
that's
what,
clear
making sure that they get that into HMRC, including postcodes.
Yes, it needs to be a validated postcode.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the onus is on an individual to comply with tax, obviously, but clearly the employers play a major part here with PAYE. So it's really around working partnership, communication and engagement.
Okay. And I think just following that up, it would be, I'm sure it probably would be helpful for us to hear from you again in terms of preparedness. You mentioned
our work in the autumn report will get into those issues, certainly, I'm sure. And
I mean, this is a key point for Welsh Government as well in terms of their discussions with the HMRC, because you know, they've got to learn about the new responsibilities they're taking on in terms of devolution, not now for Wales as well as Scotland. Yes. So I think it might be worth going on to the next issue, which is really looking at partnerships and joint working, particularly between Welsh Revenue Authority and its external stakeholders. And you do acknowledge good relationships being developed, but how effective now? It's got to move on to the effective working relationships between Welsh Treasury, Welsh Revenue Authority and their partners.
Thank you, Mayor. I think, as we say in the report, I think what we've seen to date has been very strong in those relationships. The engagement has been widespread. The key stakeholders are involved in a lot of the discussions and the process that are being developed. I think the key for the Welsh Treasury and the Revenue Authority is the framework document that's being developed at the moment. Early this year, that's going to be sort of finalised, and that's going to set out a clear understanding of how the two bodies are going to work together. So that's a key integral part of this. But I think something that needs to be explained constantly, probably to the wider stakeholders as well, because the independence issue with the WRA is vital. The perception of how that's working is vital. I think a lot of work's gone on, and I think we commented good progress has been made in that area. It is the first non-ministerial department in Wales, and that needs to be explained constantly, probably, as things develop. But I think, you know, as a fundamental sort of process through this review, what we've seen this time and last time, the engagement has been very, very strong. And the plans going forward are there to take that forward as well. So there's no worries come out from this point of view at this point in time. We will go back in the autumn next year, and we'll have another look in terms of the look back for some of the development of the WRA, and hopefully that will carry on then.
Yes. Clearly, the Welsh Government have worked very closely with the setting up the Tax Advisory Group and the Tax Forum, as sort of precursors to developing these working relationships. I mean, there are many bodies that they have to work closely with, local government in particular. I mean, they represented, I know, on both the advisory group and the forum. I mean, how have you assessed that the developing of the relationship between WRA and local government bodies?
I think we've seen that evolving over time. They recognised from the outset that there was much that they could learn from local government, particularly around revenue collection, non-domestic rating, council tax and things, and they have looked to draw on some of their expertise. You mentioned participation in the advisory group and the tax forum. There's also the lead official within Cardiff Council on revenue collection also is a member of the implementation programme board, and again I'm seeing that individual making a very helpful contribution, bringing that local government expertise and perspective around some of the real practicalities around collection rates and things. So I think they're certainly drawing on recognising the expertise that's out there, and I think there's certainly, once the WRA is up and running and into a settled state, there's certainly perhaps a useful area for them to explore around moving into working very closely with local government around the whole general concept around revenue collection from Welsh taxpayers who pay both local and national taxes. And there's scope for cooperation, coordination there to help tackle non-payment evasion rates, compliance, those kind of issues. So there's lots in local government that they can work with.
I mean, obviously strong partnerships already exist with Welsh local government, but some of the other agencies would straddle England and Wales border, particularly Land Registry and Valuation Office Agency. I mean, I think, again, hopefully those working relationships are robust.
Yeah.
They have done quite a lot of work to identify the individual properties along the border and to understand exactly where they sit then in terms of the various tax regimes that will apply from the 1st of April. So they have gone down to the nitty-gritty, if you like, from that perspective.
Okay. Nick Ramsey then. Thank you.
Diolch, Chair. Good morning. It is morning. Yeah, good morning. Still well and truly in the morning. You've said in the past that you think the Welsh Government need to do more to engage the wider public in terms of getting the message out there about taxes. I was discussing the issue over Christmas and the New Year, different meetings, and I was horrified really by how little awareness there is of the devolution of particularly of income tax. I mean, stamp duty's been in the news a little bit more recently. How do you feel about the Welsh Government's performance in terms of getting the message across? OK, maybe the WRA, that's a trickier sell because people are used to HMRC, but in terms of the actual fact that taxes are going to be paid here increasingly, how do you feel they're doing with that?
I think with public engagement, they've recognised from the outset that clearly it's very important, but they've had to prioritise. So with the two taxes coming on stream immediately, they engaged very promptly with the various landfill operators and with the players in that particular industry. With stamp duty, the property tax, they're engaging then with the profession, with solicitors, law society, estate agents and things. In terms of the general public, I think for these two initial taxes, the level of public personal public engagement with paying the tax is relatively limited because it's at third hand. It's your solicitor conveyancing who handles the stamp duty payments for you. It's really the Welsh rate of income tax is where it's really going to hit home that there is something which is new and different and people will need to respond differently to it. So that's where the public engagement is really going to need to ramp up over this next 12 to 15 months. There is almost a danger of starting too soon with that process in that you can put an announcement out and that loses currency quite quickly. So actually timing that phased communication and building up of awareness, understanding, realisation of what it means for them has got to be accompanied by clear guidance, a user-friendly website, and the Welsh Government have plans in place for those things. But I think to do too much too soon in terms of engagement with every single taxpayer in Wales might actually prove counterproductive. So I think they're pacing themselves. They've got some quite sophisticated communications expertise, I think, within the programme, which they're drawing on with their plans.
I think that's a very fair assessment, actually, in terms of where we are. I suppose with landfill tax and with stamp duty and the earlier taxes, with those stakeholders, one, that they're professional bodies, and it's important that they're aware of the obligations in terms of paying it. But with regards to income tax, that's simply, from apart from self-employed, that's going to be taken out at source by WRA or HMRC, and however it's going to happen. But yeah, I'm concerned more, I suppose, rather than the mechanics of it happening, with the public acceptance, certainly over the first few years, of the way that the way it works, the political acceptance, I suppose. And do you think, in terms of that, the government? Well, you said that you think that they're pacing themselves. Do you think that they're aware for the? I was going to say backlash. That's probably the wrong term if taxes go up, but aware of the public acceptance of the new regime.
Yeah, it is an interesting question, and I think the last Westminster budget round with the changes in stamp duty rates was actually quite helpful in just bringing to the forefront the fact that differences in tax treatment in the different parts of the UK are starting to emerge. So that's probably helping around general realisation. There are things that can be done around social media and those kind of things, as well as formal communications. But there's more certainly that needs to be done, but trying to use as many different channels of engagement as possible, I think, will also be important for them.
Okay, and on the wider issue of the Welsh Revenue Authority and the Welsh Government, do you think the relationship between those two has been understood clearly by stakeholders, or do you think more work needs to be done there?
For professional stakeholders, I would say yes. Certainly for the public, I think that public awareness campaign is probably yet to really happen. The Welsh Revenue Authority has just launched its website, but it's relatively rudimentary at the moment and will be built up over the next few months, I'm sure. But for those who need to know at the moment, I think there is awareness and understanding. But as Richard says, the point around being a non-ministerial department and assurances around the confidentiality of taxpayer information, those very important constitutional points, cannot be re-emphasised too often, really, to ensure that public confidence is maintained right from the outset.
And do you think the independence of the Welsh Revenue Authority has been effectively guaranteed and understood? I remember when Jane Hutt was the Finance Secretary, I was very concerned about people being unhappy with the WRA and simply sending their tax returns to the Minister, which would have caused many sleepless nights, I'm sure. So do you think people are aware that, as they would deal with HMRC, that they're aware that they are dealing with the Welsh Revenue Authority and not directly with Assembly members and Welsh Government?
I'm sure they will very rapidly become aware. You're right, there is certainly conceptual risk there, but I think the constitutional separation, the legal creation of the entity, a non-ministerial department with its own board, the very clear separation protocols around use of information, data transfer and things, so the safeguards are all in place. So the mechanisms are in place to deliver something which should work effectively and independently. The key thing then is to communicate and reassure that the general public that it's in place and it operates effectively, which is partly where audit comes in, of course.
Great. And still on the WRA, can you elaborate on the potential risks to effective governance concerning the dual role of the Chief Exec as the WRAIP Implementation Director?
kick off on that and then I'll come in.
Yeah. I think it was a risk that was sort of probably brought to our attention as part of the review in a way, given the Chief Exec was covering the both roles. And I think they've identified as a potential risk to them in terms of the perception again, in terms of the work he's doing to set the new organisation up and then running the new organisation. I think he wanted that extra scrutiny, that extra sort of transparency in the two roles he was performing. They put a governance arrangement in place now with the Permanent Secretary, the Chair of the Board, himself as the Chief Executive and the Director from the Welsh Treasury to actually challenge some of the decision making over and above the implementation board. And I think they've put that in place to make sure when they get to the 1st of April, it can't come back to bite them. I think because that was the worry. He's performing two roles, a service to himself. Having this in place over and above helps him get through that and gives the view to the external world that has been done properly as well. So there was a potential there. I think the work he's put in place has sort of addressed some of that.
Just for you, the Finance Secretary invited me on one of the early meetings in establishing the embryonic, I think it was Mark Drakeford actually, establishing the embryonic Welsh Revenue Authority, and I remember some big discussions about the balance between the chairman and the chief exec, and whether it would be a hands-on chairman, whether it would be a long-term chairman or a chairman there purely to set it up. Do you think all those issues have been adequately dealt with?
Yeah, I believe so. There is now a chair and board in place. The board have met. The WRA has its own offices with a plate on the wall. The role of the chief executive also being the SRO for implementation has been, I think it has been interesting to observe how the programme board governance has evolved over time. And in fairness to those involved, I think they've been aware of the governance risks and they have managed those risks really very sensibly. I think it's pragmatic risk management through the process. The governance and ownership of the WRA itself has evolved, if you like, because it began with the Welsh Government building an abstract thing which was going to be called the WRA, being built by the Welsh Government. There comes a point where, having appointed a chair and board and chief executive, that the thing they are building for them becomes actually the WRA building itself. And that migration of responsibility and ownership, they're moving through that process at the moment. So quite sensibly, I think, rather than saying there's been a firm sort of cut-off transfer of at this point everything moves across, they're handling it over time as things evolve. I think pragmatic is how I describe it, but I think it's actually been quite effective from what I've seen of it in operation around the governance. So the dual role challenge was recognised as a risk. I think they're managing it very sensibly.
Thanks. Just for members to be aware as well, you all will soon receive an invitation to a WRA event here in the Assembly, which is for all Assembly members, and hopefully we'll start to, I'm sponsoring it obviously, so that's why I know about it, but start to share some of this information. And I think it'll be one of the first times that the WRA has come as independent, truly independent, to the Assembly to share that with Assembly members. So in turn, that starts the information flow in which, you know, we as Assembly members are also part of sharing this with our constituents, of course, that this is going to happen and how it's going to happen. So just for you to be aware that that's in hand. So we'll go on with David Rees then.
Diolch, Gareth, and actually highlighting that point goes on to my first area question in, because in your earlier reports you identified 4 tranches of milestones and deliverables. We know in the 4th, and of that we got communications being clearly one of those points. And I'm not talking about the communications we got in the Welsh rate of income tax. This is more about what goes on as of 1st of April 2018. You've also identified, do you think there's expertise now in the communications within it all? Have they done enough to satisfy you that sufficient communication will be issued prior to the 1st of April 2018?
Ask us the crystal ball gaze, I'm always very nervous about in terms of making predictions. It's fair to say, I think, that as at November, as we completed our work, we were happy with where they had got to. We have looked at the plans they have in place for the many activities through January, February, March to get to go live. You know, beta testing of systems is being completed.
I'll come back to that one,
etc. The communications plans are in place, guidance is being developed and drafted. That's being itself tested with stakeholder groups for understandability. They have all the pieces in place in the jigsaw and the plan to get themselves safely to 1st of April. Whether that will happen, I don't think we would want to commit clearly.
But your belief is
have
that
the
at this point in
place.
time, you see no reason why you shouldn't?
It is well set, I think, to deliver as
I
planned.
think just to add to that as well, if you look back at the plan application before the November review, they've achieved those milestones as well. So the performance up to that point has been strong, but Mike's right, there's still a lot to do now before we get to April, and that's where trying to badge this report is good progress, but some critical months come in with lots to do, which they're aware of, and there's things that can go wrong in that period, unfortunately. So that's why we've got to make sure that the plans are there, and we can comment on the plans. Delivery now is the next stage of that process.
Okay, let's go on to the beta testing, systems testing now.
Sure.
Because one of your concerns was the digital side of things.
That's the area of highest risk, is the digital services work stream, certainly.
And I suppose first question I want to ask is, are you disappointed that having the history of systems development and always being late and over budget, are you disappointed that in fact we are in a situation where there seems to be a failure to completely identify the specifications for the design, which delayed it, and no agreements on how you would manage changes during that process? Because that seems to be fundamental to development of these systems, and are you therefore disappointed that those things have caused problems?
I don't think I'd want to characterise it as disappointment. I think this was always going to be potentially the most problematic area of the programme. You've referenced difficulties with other IT systems developed in the past. It's well understood that any new system you develop from scratch for a new function involving extensive IT, bespoke, is going to be complicated, it's going to be risky. They recognise that from the outset. In our report last year, we flagged that they were behind where they felt they needed to be at that time, and I recall the Auditor General giving evidence to this committee and emphasising this was the one area of particular concern that he had. Since then, they have clearly done a lot to address those concerns. The contingency time that they had within their programme has effectively been utilised as part of managing that process. So there's probably safe to say that there's very little contingency slack left now in the timetable to get to 1st of April. Having said that, they've made some very considerable strides over the last 2 to 3 months in terms of getting beta testing of the various components of the system, the functionality and things working together. We've reported the position as at the end of November. I suspect the committee may well want to get the very latest position from Welsh Government later in terms of what's happened since then. But disappointment is probably not the word. We've not been surprised, perhaps, but it's fair to say that they have had a particularly complex set of challenges to address here against the backstop that it has to be ready by the 1st of April. Ordinarily, with a large IT project, it is possible to slip the completion date, the implementation date. You're up here against a hard deadline. So the contingency has been in terms of time in the timetable and then bringing in additional resource capacity, expertise in a short order to keep things on track. But they've had a difficult management challenge there.
Well, perhaps I would question, and I'd question the Minister on that. But in a sense, now we are basically just in time situation. It's got to be delivered on the time now.
Yep.
Do you believe that the process and progress they've made will now allow them to deliver on time? And subsequent to that, what are your views? Would they be better off delivering something on the 1st of April, or actually having to delay something to make sure we get it right? Because you can actually deliver something on the 1st of April, which still have faults in it.
Yeah, in our report, looking at Para 231, we talked around the areas of focus for the digital work stream. One of those was around contingency plans. I think we're aware those contingency plans are in place. Obviously, with the contingency plan, they hope it's not necessarily call on it, but those plans are there. But the work that they've done around end-to-end testing over the last few weeks is nearing completion. I say you'll need to get the very latest position from Welsh Government. But again, I don't think we're in a position to make predictions as to what will happen between now and 1st of April. I don't think as auditors we can sensibly do that. I think what we can say is it's clear to us that they have robust plans in place to get them to that finish line, or indeed to activate contingency should it be necessary. So they're in about as good a place as we could reasonably expect, given where they were a year ago.
We'll have to ask the Minister some questions.
Indeed, but from your point of view, what is a contingency in this regard? Have you looked at that contingency?
Contingency plans will be things like what is the absolute baseline minimum defensible specification that absolutely has to be delivered, rather than some of the things which are very nice to have but not as mission critical.
So we're not looking at an alternative to their own system in that regard. When you say contingency, they're not looking to default to HMRC or something like that.
And that's not my understanding, no.
Yeah. You need to have to operate on 1st of April.
And bear in mind that a key milestone next month will be that final readiness sign-off, which involves both the Revenue Authority, the Treasury, HMRC. There's a formal process there involving ministers, which will be the final sort of go-no-go on a lot of this stuff.
I think it's fair to say, the question really, if we did this review early like we planned this time last year, in the June time when the gateway was happening, we'd probably have more concerns. I think with the gateway and the way they've used that, the findings and the actions, by the September time, we'd seen a step change, to be honest. They've got the expertise in to take that forward. They have got the plans in place to get there. Whether they get there, I think it's a challenge to the Minister next. But I think in June, we would have more concerns. By September, we could see the progress that's being made. I think a lot of the contingency was probably lost right at the start of the process. I think they had 5 or 6 months built into the original plans to get there. In putting the supply in place, that was 4 months later than they planned, given some of the learning they had and some of the developments and the complexities. So as of doing this report, it looks like the plans are now there to get there. Very little contingency, if any, left.
Okay. Neil Hamilton, then. Thanks.
I'd like to ask some questions about recruitment and retention of expertise. The Revenue Authority is projected to have 75 staff members. 9 of those will be for transitional period ending in 2018-19. 19 have already been appointed, 15 have taken up their posts, and of that 15, of the 19, 15, including senior posts, are on loan from Welsh Government or from HMRC. We have pointed up in the past on this committee the need to retain tax-related expertise in Wales, and the Revenue Authority obviously will be very keen to do that. It won't be able to operate properly. Do you feel that its recruitment process so far is robust enough to achieve that aim?
Yeah, go on.
I think in terms of where, again, coming back to the session last year, I think that was one of the Auditor General's concerns, and I think and the committee shared those concerns. I think the recruitment process so far, from what we've seen, has been very good. And the calibre of staff coming in has been very, very high. I think that you are right. The issue is how we maintain that staff, given they're on secondment. It's an issue they're aware of as a Welsh Revenue Authority. They've got some learning development plans being developed to share some of that knowledge, but it is a risk to them. I say 15 of the 19 are on secondment. That's a big proportion. They're going through some recruitment now over the next couple of months where they get another, I think it's 44 staff in with the 1st of April. They've got plans to do it. They're achieving those plans from what we saw, but they've got to do that as well. And I think that the challenge that they see and we see in the report is going forward, how you maintain that enthusiasm of a new organisation, the secondment and share that skills. That will be a challenge to them, which they're aware of. But I think it's getting the right people in to start the process off is what they've achieved by doing it this way, is how they build on that going forward, I think will be something they need to consider.
Yes. So is there anything more that the WRA could do you think, to improve retention of key skills?
Yeah, we've referenced in our report, looking at Para 216, 217, that recognising the extensive use of secondees, that getting robust succession planning in place, whether that is through internal promotion or further recruitment or indeed extension of secondments. But then the knowledge transfer, that as people leave, they're not simply walking out of the door with the knowledge in their heads. So they have recognised the need for that to happen. They are, I think, putting in place plans to ensure that that happens. But clearly we flagged in our report that there is more they need to do in managing that risk. You're absolutely right, with so many secondees, particularly senior posts, that succession planning, knowledge transfer will be key. Yeah,
well, you've anticipated my second question there, because knowledge transfer is not something which is easily carried out, especially in highly technical areas of work, such as complicated statutes on taxation. Although I imagine that everybody who's being recruited has tax expertise to begin with, not simply being recruited straight from university or something like that. So there is a basic expertise already in everybody who is going to be employed by the WRA. So what are the processes that they put in place to ensure this knowledge transfer at a sufficiently high level for everything to proceed seamlessly after the transitional staff have returned, assuming they're going to return to their original places of employment?
I think I'd characterise that largely in the work in progress box. It's something I think we will want to return to in our preparedness report later this year.
Right.
But where knowledge transfer, there are issues here around tax policy and things, but also then development of case precedents. So actually, the broader context of knowledge management within the organisation is perhaps equally important here as well. But they need to, they're alert to the risk, and they need to ensure that they've got learning development plans in place, which are pretty much bespoke to individual members of staff. There aren't that many staff, and while there's an element of sort of sheep dip training and things, I think a lot of this is going to be bespoke to specific functions within the organisation as it evolves.
So is this something to come back to?
I believe so, yes.
Yep. Yes, good. Yeah, sure.
I think the other point I would make is that because WRA is developing its own guidance, it is seconded staff and permanent staff that are working together to develop that guidance for themselves.
Right.
So whilst the seconded staff are bringing in useful expertise from places like HMRC and UK Treasury, what they're actually building is something unique to the WRA.
Right.
And so, in terms of that knowledge transfer, that's happening as they go along as well.
When you say guidance, are you referring to the manuals that
Yes.
HMRC produces? The
Those sorts
WRA
of
will do
things,
that.
and the internal processes and procedures that they have within the organisation itself.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Sheep dip training is a new one on me, so that's one for 2018 by the looks of it. Mike Hedges, please.
Nothing to do with sheep. WRA dedicated finance system. One of the things you've said quite regularly, and I've agreed with you, is the sharing of systems saves money. You also say, and I think in your report, it's going to cost about £500,000 to set up, and there'll be additional ongoing costs by not using the Welsh Government one. Can you explain, are you convinced of the rationale for having a dedicated system rather than sharing an existing one?
Looking at para 234 of our report, I think we pick up on this in some detail, Mike, in terms of the rationale. I think this was a change in stance. The intention at the outset was that the WRA would be piggybacked on the Welsh Government's own financial systems, in effect a separate company set up within the Welsh Government's ledgers. I think they have thought long and hard around the pros and cons, and it is a fairly finely balanced judgment as to which way to go. They've opted to go for the standalone system. In our report, we've set out some of the rationale for that. It has included looking at the experience of Scotland, but also, I think, recognising that the WRA would be, in relative terms, against the size of the Welsh Government's finance function, a relatively small player, and to have the influence to get its own precise specifications exactly met by the Welsh Government would be not as easy as if it took control of it itself. It has the benefit, I think, of emphasising again the separation of the WRA from the Welsh Government as well. And this will be something more around the perception than the reality, because clearly a separate ledger would work. But there are some challenges there. It has resulted in additional cost, and again our report brings that out. But it does mean then that as new taxes come on stream, that they are within the control of their own destiny in developing their finance systems to keep pace with that. So I can see why they've taken the decision they have.
Rationale for smaller authorities not to work with larger authorities. I mean, and you've said on a number of occasions the sharing of back office functions is a good thing, and now we're saying, well, yes, it's a good thing for local authorities. It might be a good thing for other bodies, but when we come to the Welsh Government bodies, it's not necessarily a good thing.
I think on this one...
I think Mr. Hedges has read your previous reports.
Yeah.
I don't want to answer that, but I just want to make that point for the record. The other thing I was going to say, if the finance system were created in parallel with the collection and management system, or will it happen afterwards?
So I didn't catch
Is it going to be done in parallel? I mean, it's being done at the same time.
Yes, it is happening in parallel.
And
yes.
they will both come to fruition at exactly the same time, and as such, you'll be confident they can talk to each other if they need to.
Yes, part of the key to this is the electronic interface between the tax collection management system and the core finance system. That's one of the fundamentals, and so yes, that is taking place.
But you'll only know if they can talk to each other when they're both completed, won't you?
Now, some of the functionality around communication, that is happening as part of the beta testing, so that is working through. It won't be a case of turn it on the 1st of April and hope it works. It is being developed in parallel.
But it's developed, sorry, just complete this, it's developed in parallel, but you've got two parallel systems and you've got testing to how they're working with each other, but you won't finally know if they're working completely with each other until they're both completed, will you?
That's what the testing is doing.
Yeah, but they both, if you use the beta testing and you see how they're working at different stages, but until both are complete, how will you know that everything is going to work because there'll be other bits being added to both as they make their way to completion?
The two systems are being developed in parallel.
Yeah.
The key linkages between them are being built and tested.
Yeah.
Other developments were made to both systems which wouldn't affect those linkages. So I'm not quite sure I see where...
you're saying
if I can, in another way of asking this, I
IT development.
Is this something that is being monitored by the implementation board? Is that something that you're keeping an active eye on to make sure that this interoperability...
Yeah, the Digital Services work stream is particularly focused on interoperability of systems, and they're providing assurances to the board that those linkages are being tested and it's developing nicely.
And there'll be no linkages taking place after a certain time? The bits that are added after a certain time will not involve linkages.
That's a level of detail that I simply wouldn't have here today, Mike.
But it is a matter of great importance.
I think it's probably a question for
maybe
the next session.
Maybe a question to the later witnesses.
Yeah, okay.
The governance of management of changes or specifications. Are you comfortable that the governance and management of changes of specifications to the collection system would be considering also the possible implications upon the financial system? Because that's what the real comes. If more comes in, are you comfortable that the process is in place that as they assess those changes, they will also look at the implications on the financial system?
Yeah, they absolutely have to do that because they can't look in isolation at one or the other. The interoperability of all of this is key to its success.
Though we are just at the time, but there is one question I'd like, the final question, if I may, that I think is quite important, because we do know that the implementation costs for the WRA have been weighted in a different way than was originally supposed. But it's also clear from the reports that we received that the operation costs now will be substantially higher as well. And I just wondered if you could give us a flavour of why you think that's happened. Obviously, this is something we can test in the next session as well. But I mean, is that something that's due to insufficient evidence at the start in estimating that, or is that something that's flown out of just experience and actual the way the programme has developed?
Yeah, I think in essence what's happened here is that the original estimates for building a thing called the WRA were made at the outset. The thing that is being created now looks rather different to that original thing, and accordingly the estimations for costs for that WRA have evolved. It's not, I think, the original estimates were inaccurate, it's that what is being built is different. It is bigger, it is more complicated, it has greater functionality, that is inevitably more expensive. I think it's more that as a reason for the change in costs rather than necessarily inaccuracies in the original estimates, although those were fairly broad brush estimates obviously at the start.
Okay, if we've got any further questions, we can invite you, obviously, in that regard. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the evidence. Of course, there will be a transcript for you to check as well, so thank you very much.
Fydden ni'n symud yn syth.
We'll be moving on immediately to the next session, and we'll be having a break after that.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, and welcome and good morning. If you could just, at the outset of the meeting, just ask for your names and roles for the record, please.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'm Mark Drakeford, and joining me this morning are Andrew Jeffries, the Director of the Treasury here in the Welsh Government, and Claire MacDonald, who is working on the Welsh Revenue Authority side.
Thank you very much, and for attending this morning. Of course, we're scrutinising the progress made and the devolution of fiscal powers to Wales. And of course, you published a work plan, and if I could press ahead, given that we've received your report so far, evidently you had priorities within that work plan. Could you just give us an outline of how content you are that those priorities have been achieved and that the milestones have also been achieved?
Well, thank you, Chair. As you know, we have published the plan that we have, and we did so because we wanted to create a new system here in Wales where we are open as a government about what we want to achieve and what our priorities are. And making that open so that we could bring people into the debate to have a conversation with people about the priorities and what we're seeking to do. We placed the report, or laid the report, when we published the draft budget back on the 3rd of October, and we are sufficiently confident that we are pressing ahead with the plan. We're on time with the things that are within the plan. There are some things within the plan that are down to be carried out in the short term, rates and bans, and suggestions for new taxes and so forth. And then there are other things in the plan that are there for the medium term, looking up a little further ahead than that. What we want to do is to move the timetable from the publication of things under the plan and to try to get that to a position where we can publish the plan at the start of the year, and then 9 months afterwards, in October, with the documents that we lay with the budget to feed back about what we've done. Now, only 3 months have elapsed since the last report, but what I want to do now is to bring both timetables together and to do something in this year to create patterns that we can follow in the coming year.
I understand that point is more cohesive in that sense. Is there anything, despite that, during the last few months that has shown any delays, serious delays, or something where you are concerned about that there has been slippage about?
No, I can't see any examples of where the timetable has slipped. There are a number of things in the work plan that are complex and where we will have to take time to carry out that work and to bring people in to help us to do so. However, everything within the plan, I believe, is where we expected them to be back in October.
Mike Hedges, please.
Can I move to land transaction tax then? I'm sure you would have preferred the Chancellor not to change SDLT in the autumn budget, but he has done. And he's made changes. How will this affect Welsh Government tax forecasts for next year?
Well, Chair, I will recall the debates we had here in this committee when we were establishing the rules for setting rates and bands. And I think, the system that the committee agreed has stood up to the test of actual experience, because the possibility that the Chancellor would change rates and bands halfway through our own budget process was in our minds when that final system was agreed. So, yes, our lives would have been more straightforward had that not happened, but I think the system we agreed has been able to cope with it, and we've avoided the situation of having set rates and bands, and we have to unset and reset. Because although we published our intentions, we're not going to have brought forward the regulations that will set them in Wales until the end of this month. What the Chancellor did, as members here will know, is to introduce a new relief in LTT for first-time buyers and set the threshold for that at £300,000. That did bring a consequential sum of money to Wales. And I think my job, in a way, was to think about whether we wanted to use that sum of money for these purposes, and if we did, how best to deploy it. You will know that what we will propose to the National Assembly in the regulations we'll bring forward at the end of January is that we should raise the starting threshold for paying land transaction tax to £180,000 for all purchasers in Wales. And I think this shows the merit of the system and of devolving this particular tax. I understand that when the Chancellor is setting his arrangements, he has to try and find a figure that will work for Rochdale and will work for Rochester. And the property market in the southeast of England, it will be very different to the property market in the north of England. Now, what we've been able to do is to, I believe, find a use for the money that reflects the needs of the housing market here in Wales. At £180,000, 80% of first-time buyers will pay no tax at all. To get 80% of first-time buyers in the same position in England, you have to set the threshold at £300,000. And we've been able to use the consequential money that we got to help not just first-time buyers, they would have been around 4,000 or so of those, but to help 24,000 people who are purchasing property in that relatively modest end of the market. And I think there are good equity reasons why we've decided to use the money in the way that we have.
If I could just ask one thing, because the Wales Audit Office said before you came in that there was one possible benefit that emanated from the Chancellor's decision, namely that people in Wales are now more aware that taxation is changing and that devolved taxation has been introduced. Do you share that view?
Well, I have received many letters from people who are now aware of the fact that things have changed. We know that it is sometimes difficult for people who are not familiar with things to the degree that we are to know that there have been changes. So if that has assisted some people to be able to see what the previous person told you, well, yes.
I was going to say, of course, is the great advantage you're not putting the rates on the face of the bill in the first place.
Yes,
which some people thought was a good idea, and think perhaps they probably now reconsidered. The question another question I want to ask, and it really is learning from Scotland's experience. And there was a shortfall of £11 million after the LBTT was introduced compared to the year before. Despite a higher number of transactions, this was due to forestalling. Are you concerned about that? And are you and will we really the question? that is on everybody's lips is, will we get the consequential for it if we are affected?
Well, Chair, I am concerned about forestalling, of course. I think forestalling is inevitable when you move from one system to another, almost regardless of whether the figures are any different, because the system will be different. So there will be solicitors and conveyancers in Wales who are very familiar with the way the current system operates, and some of them are going to think to themselves in March, well, if I bring those transactions forward into March, I'll be dealing with them according to the system with which I'm very familiar. And if I leave them into April, there will be a new system that I've got to be familiar with. And even if the new system is very straightforward and very recognisable, it will still be new. So I think there will be some behavioural effects inevitably, and there will be a very small number, I believe, slightly different to the position in Scotland. There will be a small number of transactions that will be brought forward into March in order to avoid a higher rate of tax that would otherwise be paid in April. Now, that is a one-off windfall to the Treasury. And you'll have seen that the OBR forecasts that at around £6 million. And I know that I think Mr. Choate said to you, 6 million, that's, you know, small change. Well, I suppose when you're the OBR and you're looking at, you know, many billions of pounds, 6 million does look like a small amount, but it's not a small amount for us in Wales. So I have had a discussion with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who's followed up by discussions with officials that I know Andrew was involved in yesterday, in which you know, my clear position to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is that the fiscal framework allows for behavioural effects, second-order effects, to be taken into account. It doesn't guarantee what the outcome is, but it does say that they do have to be considered, and that we expect that the forestalling effect to be considered within the rules of the fiscal framework. And then hopefully we will get the money back. Scotland did get some of the money back, not all, but Scotland did get some of the money back that they lost through forestalling. And my position is that the same outcome should be secured for Wales.
Yeah, I think I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with you on that. And I think that if no detriment means anything, then we should get that money. Can I just finally, moving on, readiness for the transition to devolved taxes. Are you confident that we are ready for the transition, that on day one the new taxes will be able to come in efficiently, effectively and without any problems?
Well, this is a major undertaking, Chair, and there are some risks involved in it, undoubtedly, and there's a lot of work still to be done in the weeks between now and the 1st of April. But we passed a significant landmark yesterday, or a milestone anyway, yesterday, which maybe Andrew will tell you a bit more about because he was at the meeting. So part of the meeting that took place between our senior officials and senior officials at the Treasury yesterday was to carry out what we had already agreed, which would be a joint readiness assessment between the governments to see whether that assessment confirmed that things were in a sufficient state of readiness for the Treasury to take the actions it needs to take to switch off SDLT and going to landfill disposal tax as it currently is, so that we can take them on the 1st of April. So they have to take action to do that. There has to be a Treasury order made and laid, hopefully now in February, to disapply UK taxes in Wales from April. There were 24 different tests that joint committee had set out that they would need to be satisfied in order to advise ministers that the system was in a sufficient state of readiness to do that. And the good news is that I think after, you know, a pretty thorough exploration of it all yesterday, those senior officials have concluded that things are sufficiently in place and sufficiently securely in place that they will recommend to me and to the Chief Secretary that we can proceed to turn those taxes off. And I think that's a pretty good independent sort of sign that things are sufficiently on track to take that next big step on the journey. So I don't want to sound as though I think everything is easy and straightforward, because it's not. There are complex matters here and still a lot of detailed work to be done. But I think we can take some confidence from yesterday's outcome.
Okay. I think we might want to explore some of those more complex matters now, so we'll move on with Nick Ramsey to start.
Diolch. Morning, Minister. Secretary, Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning.
In terms of the setup of the WRA and how it's progressing and the costs involved, the Welsh Audit Office, we've just taken evidence from, stated that there's a very high risk that the digital tax collection and management system may not be delivered in time for when the new taxes are switched on. What's the WRA doing to mitigate this risk, and what contingency plans do you have in place?
Thank you, Nick, and Claire, who leads in the WRA on lots of these things, can give you much more hands-on detail than I can. But obviously we keep a very close watch on all of these things, and I meet monthly with Claire and with the Chief Executive of the WRA to be assured about the way in which things are on track, and the digital side of things is a major part of the way in which we want the WRA to be able to function in future. It's one of the big advantages of having established the WRA and given it the responsibilities that we have, rather than relying on HMRCs, that we've been able to design the system for the digital age in a way that HMRC, with all its legacy systems, doesn't have the same blank sheet to work from. So we have a WRA digital tax system supplier. It's a firm called Kainos. And they have done a great deal of work over the last 2 months, and the WRA has a digital tax system ready for registration and in the final stages of developing its system for filing a tax return. They're on target to deliver a completed digital tax system by the end of February, and testing of the bits of the system that are completed has already started with landfill site operators, for example, where in many ways registration is the key thing to get right in landfill disposal tax. If you've got digital registration right, then many of the other things will follow fairly smoothly from that. On LTT, you have a need for registration, but you also have, we have a very clear ambition for having a full digital tax system for filing a tax return in LTT. That is near the end of its development. There are plans in place to test it with solicitors, agents and so on at the end of January. So we remain, our ambition is, and we think we've got good reasons for some confidence, that we will have all of that in place by the end of March, and therefore ready to go live when the WRA goes live. However, we recognise...
To put it another way, do you think the Welsh Audit Office then are being over-cautious in expressing their concerns about the possible this not happening, or do you think they're basing their assertions on the way a system was before maybe you've stepped in and you've tried to address the issue?
I don't, to be critical at all of the WAO's report. I think their reports have been very helpful, the one they did previously, and they're right to say that this is a high-risk part of the business, because getting the WRA to where we want it to be.
There's no wiggle room, is there?
No, and in the last few weeks, as we're into weeks now, aren't we? Reading into the 1st of April, they're right to say that there isn't a great deal of time to make things good if things don't work out the way that we hope they will do. So I'm not quarrelling with their assessment that this is, a risky end of things. I think if you look back a year to their previous report, they signalled other things that were a risk, but where we've been able to demonstrate that those things have been successfully completed. And I think we will be able to demonstrate that we can successfully complete this too. But the second part of their report and the second part of Nick Ramsey's original question was what things are in place to be able to deal with an outcome in which things don't work out in that way. So the WRA, working with HMRC, have been putting into place a series of fallback measures so that if things don't work out in the way that we hope, so for example, if the digital tax system were to fail on the 1st of April, then there is ready and capable of being immediately deployed an online form which taxpayers and agents could use to complete their tax return in LTT. So that's not there because we think we will need it, so we don't hope to need it, but it's there and it's ready, and it's, you know, it could be deployed immediately if the high risk turns out to be, you know, more of a real risk than we anticipate.
We accept the high risk. IT in any organisation implementation runs at risk, but this has been, I suppose, interesting is the word, because we've had to change scope halfway through because of the additional rate. So that has meant different discussions with different people. But we've worked hard on that, and we are assured that when people want to put their tax returns online in April, they will be there. The risk really lies behind the back office systems that the Welsh Government will have, because we've implemented a finance system in a very short period of time, and the integration between those two systems. So the customer will see a form to complete, and they will complete it. It's the amount of work we need to do behind. We've taken the risk to try and integrate those systems, because the benefit of that is a huge benefit to the WRA going forward.
Oh, so the taxpayer, it very likely, in any outcome, won't notice a difference up front, but could there then be subsequent delays in terms of the processing of that, or have I misunderstood?
No, because we've got, not to bore you with a load amount of detail, behind everything is an enormous amount of processes, and so we've been working hard to get those processes absolutely right. And behind those processes, you have a number of contingency plans behind those. The amount of contingency plans I can bring in today is about that wad thick to make sure that we actually can do that on that day, and then subsequently after that. We will know in February where those systems can actually talk to each other. We've done some initial findings. That's gone very positively. We've just done an IT health check. That's gone positively. So we are working hard, and our supplier is working hard with us, because we both want to achieve that same outcome.
Great. Turning to the expertise, I think Neil Hamilton asked this to the Welsh Audit, or similar question to the Welsh Audit Office. The importance of retaining specialist skills and tax expertise required by the WRA within Wales. How has this influenced the recruitment process?
Well, Chair, I think a year ago the WRA were, and again we accepted that, they were saying that recruitment was one of the major challenges that the WRA would face over that period. And it was a fair warning, because we've never had to recruit people with these skills in Wales before. They are not always in huge supply, and you might have thought that attracting people to come and work for a new organisation would have its challenges. I think I've probably said to committee before that the scale of the WRA, around 40 or so posts involved in it. We've now got 32 people appointed. The whole of the executive team is in place. We've attracted around 8 applicants for every post that's been advertised. We've recruited from 14 different UK government departments to attract those people. So we've been able to attract people who are working in Wales already for the DVLA, for example, but we've also been able to attract those people who I think we may have talked about before, or people who've made their careers outside Wales but have reached that point in their careers where they would like to be able to come back to Wales and settle back here. We've got a number of examples where we've been able to do that successfully. I think 13 of the 32 appointments are of people who are fluent in the Welsh language, so that was another part of our staff recruitment ambition, was that we would be able to have a fully bilingual service in the WRA, and I think having over a third of the staff appointed who are equally fluent in Welsh and English is a good sign too. So there are posts that we're still recruiting to, and that effort will need to go on. But given some of the anxieties we had in the beginning, I think we've probably done as well as, or a bit better than we had expected 12 months ago.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the thing that one area that we were particularly concerned about a year ago was getting people in who had practical experience of running tax systems, not necessarily our ones, exactly the taxes that we were introducing, but serious operational experience in another tax authority. And we've been really pleased that we've been able to attract a number of very, very able people with that kind of background into the WRA. And they're valuable for various reasons. One is to make sure we can hit the ground running on day one, but also crucially to transfer that knowledge to another cadre of people perhaps who haven't got that experience at the moment, but need to gain and develop it over the next couple of years. The sort of future of the WRA, I suppose. So yeah, we've made some really good progress with that, we think.
And of course, it'll be about retention as well as recruitment, won't it? Which is the flip side of the coin.
Yeah.
Well, Chair, that's a very important point, I think, because an organisation with only 40 or so people working in it, you're not going to see somebody joining it at the age of 21 and still be working their way up the hierarchy when they retire. So to attract the sort of people we need to attract, what we have to be able to do is to demonstrate to those people that there are other opportunities where their skills will be valuable, and other opportunities for them to develop their careers here in South Wales. It was one of the factors that played its part in the location decision, which people here will remember. But the fact, for example, that we've got ONS on our doorstep in Newport as well, where lots of the same analytical skills will be important there as here, then those opportunities become really important in the retention issue, because people come here knowing that the WRA isn't a sort of cul-de-sac where once they're in it there'll be nowhere else that they can go. There are other opportunities in Wales where those people know that their skills will be needed, and there will be opportunities for them as well. And we think that's a strength in terms of being able to attract people but also to retain them in the WRA and in South Wales.
Could I just ask you on that for me? We did have evidence previously from the audit office, however, that a lot of these are secondments rather than long-term appointments. Is that a concern for you in terms of what you've just described?
No, Chair, it's not, because it was a deliberate part of our strategy, really. It's a new organisation. So I think you can understand that someone who might be willing to come to work in it might also want the safety net of knowing that if it doesn't work out and it isn't what they were expecting, that they haven't given up the job that they have come from. So we do have a number of people who've come, for example, from HMRC and who are currently coming to us on a secondment basis. I'm always been very comfortable with the idea that people move around the public service on a secondment basis, because I think we benefit and they benefit from that. If they end up going back to HMRC and we have other people who come to us on a secondment basis, I think that will be good in itself. But if, having come to the WRA, they decide that this is where they want to stay, then they'll be able to make that decision as well. So I think from the very beginning we anticipated and wanted to make a virtue of the fact that a certain number, I think you've got to be careful that it's not too large a proportion, that a certain number of the people we would recruit would come to the WRA on a secondment basis. And I think we're comfortable with the proportion of people we've got on that basis so far.
Some of those numbers are also Welsh Government staff who are seconded into the WRA, and some of this is just about the initial stages of a new organisation, that as the Minister said, it's much easier to kind of attract a wide field if people have the ability to hedge their bets and go on to comment or loan rather than kind of commit permanently to a new organisation they don't really know much about how it's going to develop. So, you know, to widen the field, you definitely wanted to be able to offer jobs on secondment and loan, but that doesn't mean those people will necessarily be going back to the previous place after 2 or 3 years.
So most of them are going into the new body with the intention of staying if they like it, and it's not simply a loan with the intention of going back to where they
different
started.
individuals are in different positions, of course, but yes, you know, the people I've spoken to anyways, a lot of them are kind of, you know, very excited about a longer term opportunity rather than just a kind of couple of years. And you know, a number of the appointments have been made on a permanent basis now as well, so you've got a mix in the organisation.
Perhaps I could also follow up. It's good to hear about the highlands already in terms of bilingual skills. Diversity, hopefully. I mean, this is going to be a new modern organisation for Wales, and I hope that is also reflected in terms of gender and disability, particularly, and ethnicity.
Andrew, no better than me at the staffing level. Chair, you know that the chair of the WRA is a woman, which we are very pleased to be able to appoint, and that there's a good gender balance in relation to the board of the WRA, and we do struggle sometimes to recruit in people from minority ethnic backgrounds into some of these posts, but it will be our ambition, definitely, that the WRA is a properly diverse organisation that reflects the...
If you don't have anything now, can you share any figures with the committee later? Because it would be interesting just to keep an eye on.
Yeah, no, very happy.
And obviously some of this will be, if you have quite, as I understand, quite a high proportion of secondments at the moment, then, you know, we'll need to monitor this as it's implemented, if you like, as it moves on. Yeah. Okay, back to Nick Ramsey then.
Yeah, could you provide an update on discussions relating to data collection and sharing arrangements with HMRC and Revenue Scotland?
Thank you, Chair. Well, all the legal gateways are now in place, and we've talked about this here before, and I brought regulations to the floor of the Assembly to create the legal gateways that allow data to be shared between the three players there. And actually there are two other significant players where data sharing is important as well, in the VOA and also the Land Registry, where we need to make sure that information can flow properly between all of those who have a part to play in land transaction tax in particular. HMRC will have put the necessary legislation in place to share data with the WRA from the 1st of April. We are developing memorandums of understanding and information sharing agreements with those other bodies. We'll have a near final draft of the MOU with HMRC in place, and we hope to be able to share that formally with HMRC by the end of this month. So these are absolutely important building blocks in being able to make sure that information flows through the new system in the right way. And I think, you know, that the necessary building blocks are either there already or will be there by the time we get to the 1st of April.
And that was one of the main focuses of the joint readiness assessment that we completed yesterday. You know, HMRC, to a certain extent, HMRC are not so bothered about us being able to collect taxes in Wales. They want to make sure they're getting the data and that we're not collecting their tax that should be due to them. And a lot of that is about their being able to share data between the organisations. And so in a good number of the criteria we ticked through yesterday were about the ability to share data between the organisations, and we're well on track with all of that.
We have regular discussions with, even though we're working on the information agreement with Revenue Scotland, we have regular monthly discussions with them around you know, they're actually operating now. What does that actually mean? And actually they're learning stuff from us at the moment as well, because they're procuring their contracts for their IT. So there's that knowledge sharing already progressing.
Good. And can you elaborate on the extra costs for the collection and management of higher rates for additional residential property transactions?
Thank you, Chair. So this is the single biggest change in the scope of responsibilities to be discharged by the Welsh Revenue Authority between the costs that were known or estimated at the outset and the costs that we now know the WRA will need to incur. So we anticipate 7,500 transactions in a 12-month period where the additional residential property rate will apply. Net, we expect that to bring in about £65 million. Sorry, gross, we expect £65 million to come in through the tax. But it's one of the complexities of the tax, and one of the reasons it costs money to administer is that you hand back quite a lot of this tax to people too. So we expect about 15 million of the 65 million to be repaid to people as they dispose of one of the properties that they have within the 3-year period that they have to be able to do so. So it's a relatively administratively intensive tax to get right. But nevertheless, it is bringing in quite a lot more than was expected when it was first introduced. And that's why we decided, you remember the debates in front of the committee, to retain that additional rate in Wales, because otherwise we'd be £50 million worse off as far as public services are concerned. But in order to collect the 50 million, we have to spend about 2 million. Just under 2 million, actually.
So before this, it was the transaction task. Actually, you didn't really care who the buyer was. You just wanted to know about the transaction. Because we have to refund, we need to know who we're refunding to and make sure we're refunding to the correct person. Also, as well, for compliance purposes, we need to understand who is doing these amount of transactions and if one particular person is doing an enormous amount of these transactions. So that's where the complexity with the IT system comes into then, and working hard on that.
Okay, thanks.
David Rees.
You've already mentioned quite a bit this morning about a reasonable working relationship with the HMRC. Well, in relation to the Welsh rates of income tax, which will be next year, you've set 5 priorities, 4 which I can see actually are involving really your relationship with the HMRC. So what progress is being made with regard to the Welsh rates of income tax and the discussions with the HMRC?
Well, Chair, this is a very important part of our discussions with HMRC. We've got lots of discussions with them, as David Rees has said, about the taxes that are already devolved to Wales, but we have Welsh rates of income tax coming our way before very long, and a successful implementation of all of that really will depend upon the HMRC being properly prepared for that. So we continue to have detailed discussions with them. I believe that Jim Hanna, who is the most senior person with responsibility for these things in HMRC, is to come in front of this committee later this month. So I hope you'll be asking him how
in HMRC again, yes.
you know, how well prepared they are. I set out the priorities of the Welsh Government as far as Welsh rates of income tax are concerned, and that included that senior officers of HMRC should make themselves available to this committee. So I'm pleased to see that happening. And I wrote to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to set out our requirements. We are working very closely with HMRC. We do rely on them to discharge their part of this bargain. And we will continue to have those discussions with them so that they can provide us and you with the assurances we need that they are putting the necessary resources into this, that they're prioritising it in the way that they need to, and that they can leave us all, assured that they will be delivering on the things that they have to deliver in order that Welsh rates of income tax can be implemented on time. I agreed as part of the fiscal framework with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to introduce Welsh rates of income tax at the earliest point in the timetable they could be introduced. And the UK government was keen that we should do that. For that to be practically successful, the HMRC has to deliver its side of the bargain.
Okay, obviously I appreciate that HMRC is going to be doing responsibilities, and they've already given you an estimated cost for their work between 5 and 10 million. Have you had a chance to assess those estimated costs, and do you think they're fair, particularly in relation to the fact that the initial cost for Scotland were double that effectively?
Well, I think we have to take a properly sceptical attitude towards these costs, and I'm additionally sceptical because of what has happened so recently in relation to the costs that HMRC are seeking to extract from us in relation to land transaction tax, where the bill they are presenting to us went up very significantly in comparison with the original estimates that they provided to us. So we are having to pay considerably more to HMRC for them to put themselves in a position where our land transaction tax can be successfully implemented. I will certainly be asking Mr. Hanna questions about how that came about when I meet him, I think, on the same day as you will be meeting him. And the fact that they got that so badly wrong inevitably casts some scepticism into our minds in relation to the figures that they have provided for Welsh rates of income tax.
Because that was just about turning off a tax. Correct? That's just the cost of turning off a tax.
Yeah. I mean, most of the costs are to do with them getting access to our data and ensuring that data flows through HMRC systems in the way that it needs to. So, yeah, you kind of think, oh, all you're doing is disapplying it in Wales. That can't cost very much, but it's all the kind of continuing interest that HMRC have in transactions in Wales that really where the costs arise.
It sounds a bit gilded to me, that.
Well, I will certainly be asking Mr. Hanna how this came about, and whether the fact that they got their sums so wrong in the beginning, that the answer to that is that the Welsh Government should pay the costs of their mistake. But there we are. That's a discussion we will have. Much bigger sums of money. Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's a bit of a concern in one sense because both with land transaction tax and with the income tax, Scotland has gone first, and you would think they'd be learning from examples as a consequence of that, and therefore big estimates will be closer.
Well, I think in LTT, what they will say to you is that HMRC had moved from one system to a completely different system between the time that they dealt with turning off the Scottish equivalent and now dealing with us. And it's because there is a completely different system that they are dealing with that their costs turn out to be higher than anticipated. However, on the Welsh rates of income tax, then exactly the point that David Rees has made ought to be true. And the estimates that we have been offered from HMRC of between 5 and 10 million pounds are much more encouraging to us, and they are where they are lower than the costs in Scotland, we are told by HMRC, because they have learnt from what happened in Scotland, and we are able to get the benefit of that experience by going second. So the costs to us will be lower than they were in Scotland because of, they put things right and learned things when doing it with Scotland, and we're going to get the benefit of that. And Chair, I suppose it would be fair for me to say that the prize of getting much lower costs on Welsh rates of income tax would significantly outweigh the costs we are incurring in LTT. In other words, if you wanted one of these to go your way, one of them not to, it's much better that we are getting the benefit in Welsh rates of income tax, where it'll be several millions more than the extra money we're having to pay on LTT. So, our job is to hold them to these estimates. I certainly don't expect the same problem to arise a second time.
Does that mean you also don't expect the same problem because they actually seem to have lost 400,000 odd Scottish taxpayers as well?
Well, that is a way in which we are working closely with them to make sure that the difficulties which they experienced in identifying individuals who were to be held responsible for Scottish rates of income tax. As you know, the legislation sets out who will be liable for Welsh rates of income tax, and I think we have to have some optimism that the glitches that they experience in correctly identifying individuals in the Scottish context, that they will have learnt from that. They tell us they have learnt from it. We have a representative on the project board with them, preparing for exactly these sorts of issues, and that we won't expect the same problems to reoccur in Wales.
But as Mike Hedges pointed out in the earlier session, the cross-border flow between Wales and England is far greater percentage-wise than the cross-border flow between Scotland and England. And therefore it does sort of gives us some concerns that they may not be ready for that, and therefore the costs could be high as a consequence.
Well, all I can say, Chair, is that we share the same anxieties. And we're right to. They are the obvious things that we should be concerned. And we work away with HMRC on those things. But these are the things for which they are responsible. And that's why them coming here and being accountable to the Welsh Government as well, and to the UK Government, given what I said to you about, how keen they were that we did this at the earliest opportunity. They too have an interest in making sure that it doesn't go wrong, because HMRC doesn't prioritise it or invest in it or give it the significance that we know that it has for us.
Okay, just on this. Yeah.
Here now, he would say, this is not abnormal in Europe, and that perhaps HMRC could be learning for what happens in other parts of Europe, where people work in one area, but their tax has to be paid in a different one.
I think we talked here in the committee about the city in Holland, where property transactions are the responsibility of the Belgian authorities, for example. So yes, in a European context, this would not be unusual at all.
You finished? Is it okay to move on with Neil Hamilton, please?
I'd like to ask a question about potential new devolved taxes. Some of these taxes' success will be measured by how little they raise, I suppose, like the disposable plastics tax on the one hand, and others, like just take the random tourist tax, probably by the opposite, how much it raises. What work have you done, or what thinking have you given so far to the criteria for selection from the list that's already been published about how suitable these taxes might be, and on the other hand, the potential impact upon the people of Wales? What's going to be uppermost in your mind here when you form a view as to A, the shortlist, and B, the final choice?
Well, Chair, first of all, just to agree with the point that Mr Hamilton made at the beginning, and it is a really important point to try and get into the debate. The taxes have more than one potential purpose. Some of them are primarily about raising revenue, some of them are about changing behaviour. And not all taxes have the identical underlying motivation behind them. So I think that's an important part in the debate that people don't always appreciate at the outset. I think it's important just to say again that what we are doing in the very first part potential tax that we will select is to test the new machinery. So that's also in my mind as to whether this is the sort of tax which is suitable for that machinery testing purpose. So that's one of the criteria that I will be thinking against the 4 different taxes that were on the short list. I'll then be thinking about the criteria that we set out in our tax policy document, the tests that we set out for what taxes should be in Wales, and I have to have some. I have to pay some attention to the criteria set out in the Wales Bill itself of 2014, because the command paper there set out a series of tests that would need to be applied to any new proposal. So that's what I will be doing, have been doing. I've met all my Cabinet colleagues who have an interest in this already. We are moving into the final few weeks of the work that we are doing to assess the different possibilities on the shortlist. My ambition is to be able to come to the Assembly before half-term and to say, this is the one that I've now decided for now. You know, that doesn't mean to say that other things on the list have just forgotten, but we've got to test the system for the first time, and that this is the one of the 4 that I think will be most suitable for doing that. We've had a series of discussions with the UK government about the part that they will then play. And we talked about this on the floor of the Assembly yesterday. And I'm not sure whether we will get to a completely final agreement with the UK government in advance of testing the machinery for the first time, but we will be pretty close, I hope, to an agreed protocol with the UK government that will set out how they will respond. I will send a tax up the line. The first action then lies with them, and I hope that we will have an agreed document with them that will set out how they will then go about responding. So a lot of that work is also going on over the next few weeks to try and get that in place by the time I identify the one of the 4 that we will use in the first instance.
If I may just ask specifically on that protocol, which is also what I was asking yesterday on the floor, would that include some expectation of a reasonable timetable? Because one of the difficulties with the ELCO system, of course, which this is worryingly similar to, is things got lost in Whitehall for many months.
Yeah. Well, part of my ambition in negotiating the protocol is to avoid some of what we would now see as the downsides of the ELCO process. I'm not certain that we will be able to agree a timetable for this first one, because everybody will be in the position not knowing quite how long any part of the process will take. And I'm afraid we are also getting a bit of a feeling that we are going to be meeting the Brexit legislative load here too, that we will be asking the Treasury to do this new piece of work for us at the same time as they are having to deal with, you know, a very considerable degree of legislative activity that flows from the Brexit decision, and that might have an impact on how quickly the Treasury will be able to take forward the work that they will need to do on this proposal. But we will try and get a sense that it shouldn't take more than 12 months for them to complete everything that we would expect them to complete. And after they've done it the first time, and we've all learned from that, I would hope that after that, the process will be considerably shorter.
Sorry, thank you.
It's okay, thank you. Good, well, thank you very much for that. Time's marching on, so perhaps I better not explore that point any further. But I'd just like to ask now what consideration has been given for developing a legislative budget process, because as you know, the Wales Act enables Wales to develop and introduce its own financial framework legislation. So we've talked about this before, of course. I wonder if you could give us an update on your thinking there.
I don't think, Chair, that I'm very much further forward than the last time we discussed it. I think we've agreed between the government and the committee that the process we used in the current round, that we should replicate it next year, and that in the current state of devolved taxes, that it more or less worked in the way that we hoped that it would do. So we know what we're going to do next year. This committee has committed itself to doing a piece of work in total inquiry into legislative budget processes. I'm looking forward to following that inquiry to see where it takes you, and then hopefully to continue to do things in the way that we've done up until now, which is to work cooperatively and to see if your inquiry leads you to a conclusion that a legislative budget process is proportionate to the level of responsibilities we have, and that it would provide advantages over and above the system we currently have, then I will be very open to discussing that with you.
Okay, we'll talk about.
We'll certainly take up those offers, I think. Can we conclude with Jane Hutt, please? Thank you.
A couple of questions about forecasting and your work with OBR. When Robert Choke came to speak, gave evidence in December, well, you would have seen what he said. He actually did. The issue about timing, he said, was a challenge for them, not just in terms of our draft budget, the November budget. He also talked about their other responsibilities as well, in terms of national accounts, the UK government, etc. So, you know, could you just say something about how you're working with them in terms of those comprehensive forecasts that you need, but also this continuing question about Welsh-specific data as well?
Well, Chair, I heard what Mr. Choate said to you, and I met him later in the day and had a further conversation with him about it all. The good news is that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, I think, has been helpful in this regard and has made it clear to her officials that she wants us to have a proper conversation with the OBR about what it could do if we were to ask it to undertake this role for us, and what it would be able to do by when in the annual timetable for these things. So that I think is what Robert Choke was most concerned about with you and with me, is not that they couldn't do the work, not that they didn't want to do the work, but that the work they might want to do for us, we might be asking them to do it at the very point in their cycle where they are most busy in discharging responsibilities they already have. Now, I don't believe at the moment that those difficulties are insurmountable, and the detailed discussion is going on with the OBR about that. But if at the end of it, you know, there was an offer we had to weigh up, then I'm certainly happy to you know, share that with the committee. Because you will be as interested in our work as I will be. If we were to conclude that what the OBR is able to do in that practical sense doesn't match what we need, then there are we've always had other possibilities for this. And the good news here is that the Bangor work that we've had this year has turned out to be, I think, of good calibre, and the Treasury are less anxious about us continuing to use that route for the time being while we set up something else. So I hope the OBR will still be the route we can go down. I think there are significant advantages in doing it. If the practicalities defeat us, because they just can't do what we need them to do, then we will go to some of the other possibilities we've talked about in front of the committee. There will be next year a lot more Welsh-specific information in the tax field, because the WRA will be producing Welsh-specific information that we've never had before. And, you know, in landfill disposal tax, we rehearsed this here before. The way the OBR forecasts moved around was because they've never had or needed Welsh-specific information before. The WRA will be a very important source of that information. If we're talking about Welsh-specific data in relation to more macroeconomic analysis, then what I asked Mr. Choate, and I think he would think about it, is there data that if we were to make what could be quite a considerable investment in obtaining that data, did he believe that it would be likely to make a material difference to the sort of forecasts that they could make? Now, if the answer to that is yes, that if we make that investment and produce that data, then the forecasts would be better, more reliable, would be different for Wales, then there will be a case for making that investment. If the answer is you could produce all that data, but actually it might make very little difference to your macroeconomic forecasts because they are dominated by not just what happens in the Welsh economy, but what happens in the wider UK economy. And we can produce all that data and make very little difference. Well, I'd be much less attracted to finding money to produce data that didn't lead us very far. And I think the jury is still out, really, in that debate.
Okay. Fine. I mean, I think just final point. We've talked about block grant adjustment, but of course it is OBR who will be, who will be calculating in terms of their fiscal and economic outlook from November in terms of block grant adjustment. And we've heard already about how we should be hearing by the end of the year, but it would be helpful just to, if you've got any predictions about impacts of this in terms of the outcome.
Well, briefly, Chair, I think there are three aspects that are worth reporting this morning. So over the 3-year period, 18-19 to 2021, we expect the impact of the fiscal framework on what we know so far, that will bring about £70 million to Wales that otherwise would not have come to Wales. So we can see that 105% multiplier beginning to make a difference there. The way we have chosen to use our tax responsibilities, I think adds another £30 million into that over a 3-year period. So there's £100 million now available in revenue for Welsh Public Services as a result of us taking on these responsibilities that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And in tough times, £100 million, I know it's over 3 years, but it all counts and it all makes a real difference. And because we are taking on fiscal responsibilities, we have new borrowing powers as well. And as from 1920, we will be able to borrow £150 million a year on the capital side of the budget as well. So there I think you begin to see the fact that there is a genuine impact, a genuinely beneficial impact on both the revenue and the capital sides of our budgets as a result of the new responsibilities we are taking on and the way we are choosing to exercise them.
Thank you.
Just on that to note, as we close this session, that we did, of course, invite Alan Cairns to give evidence on precisely this aspect of the block grant adjustment. He has unfortunately declined the committee's invitation once again. We'll discuss that in a second as a committee, but just that's on the record as part of this discussion.
Therefore, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and of course there will be a transcript of all that you've said for you to check for accuracy, should that be necessary. Thank you very much. And whilst we are still in public session, if I may just draw the committee's attention to what I've just discussed, which is a letter that we've received from Alan Cairns, the Secretary of State for Wales, and also the 3rd annual report from the United Kingdom on introducing and implementing Part 2 of the Wales Act 2014. So the UK government has given us a report, as is required under the Act, and presented it to the Assembly about the implementation of fiscal devolution. But once again, the Secretary of State has not agreed to come and give oral evidence and in public to the committee. We have, of course, extended all the collaboration possible and in terms of the alternative methods, whether that be dates or video conferencing, in order to facilitate this. But I was just eager to share that with the committee and to give the committee the opportunity also to express views on that. So I don't know if anyone has a comment to make before we go into private session.
Okay.
Disappointing.
Disappointing, yeah.
Very disappointing. Yeah. Because there is a good news story as well in terms of the impact of fiscal.
Fiscal devolution seems to be on track, seems to be timetabled. The risks are acknowledged, but are being taken care of, and there's a lot of substantial work being done to make this a success, both on, by Westminster as well as by the Welsh Government and independent bodies such as the OBR. So to me, it is disappointing that the Secretary of State does not want to discuss this in a public session. Secretary of State for Wales.
Well, it's quite clear that it's not diary commitments that is preventing his appearance before this committee. I mean, that is a deceit.
Well, he is actually in Wales today.
He's in Wales today, is he?
He's actually in my constituency this morning. So.
Well, thank you for that
Maybe we should
local information.
There.
Which
reconvene up there, shall we?
We would have been delighted to have even visited your constituency to talk to him, if necessary, David. But we'll note that for now. But
could we make an appointment to visit his constituency surgery?
Well, yeah, we could possibly do that. I think that's. We prefer as a committee that he came to us. I think would be correct. And obviously, when we report to the Assembly on these matters, we'll note our disappointment in that regard, if that's acceptable. In which case, Guy, now...
May I now propose that we move into private session under Standing Order 17.42? And if you agree with that for the rest of the agenda, we will also take a brief break until 11:30.
11 now, and then we'll be in session, private session after that. Right now.